And so that's sort of well known. I've replotted it here in the inverted mode. The other modes are a little bit more interesting to me because they're a little newer and may have some longer term consequences. So El Nino varies on a 2 to 8 year frequency. It turns out there is also a decadal frequency to El Nino. So from decades to decades, El Nino varies. The second mode turns out to be something called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And it's the only of the principal modes that is not really Pacific dominated. I'm not going to talk much about it. It has a very low frequency variation. So this mode is very highly correlated with an index called the AMO. And the El Nino is very highly correlated in mode 1 with something called the multivariate El Nino index. The third mode is associated with the Pacific decadal oscillation, which is something that many of you are probably familiar with as well. The only difference with this mode is that it has a different spatial pattern than the traditional PDO mode, which is calculated from just the North Pacific. And I'll get into the reason for that in a little bit. The fourth mode is something that is just emerged, and it is associated with something called El Nino Modoki. And Modoki in Japanese is for like, but not the same. So it's an El Nino that's like, but not the same typical one. And it's also associated, I ran out of space here, with something that a scientist at Georgia Tech called Emmanuel De Lorenzo has labeled the North Pacific gyre oscillation. It turns out that those two things are one and the same. One of them calculated it from here northward, the other group calculated it from here southward, and they just happen to be the same thing. And over the last decade or so, we have been having a preponderance of El Nino Modokis, and therefore we haven't really had any strong El Ninos here. And the most interesting thing about this mode is that the amplitude seems to be growing with time. So that, is this something associated with something we're doing, or is this just something like the appearance of something, some new natural variation? The other thing to note in all of these series is that there seems to have been, all of them seem to have a kind of a sharp break associated with 97, 98. Now when you take, and again I apologize for the quality of this, but it's big enough so that you can still see it. When you take the globe and you remove periodicities that are less than 10 years, this is the pattern of variability that you're left with. And associated with this, and this is more like the traditional PDO pattern. So it combines the El Nino decadal variability with this third Pacific mode that seems to be independent of El Nino, and you're left with this PDO pattern. And what you see at the top here, and in these dotted lines, are periods when we had some very large changes in ecosystems in and around California. The first one, I'm not sure if there are anecdotal reports of big changes in 1925. Somebody here probably knows. But certainly there was a demise of the sardines associated with the shift in the mid-1940s. The 1976 worm regime is very well known, and I would argue that we have recently come into a new regime associated with this cooling. And so climate changes on these same timescales, and it also impacts our ocean climate changes on these timescales, and it also impacts regional climate in California. And this is the pattern in sea level pressure. This is lower than normal versus higher than normal. So the Aleutian low tends to intensify during warm periods and tends to weaken during these cool periods. So the opposite would be appearing during these periods. And that's been partly responsible for the long-term drought that California has felt over the last decade or so. That pattern that you see here, this decadal pattern, you can see in this picture, which looks quite a lot like the El Nino pattern. So when this area is warm, this is cool. When this area is cool, this is warm. We're actually in the inverse pattern, right? Because we're going to multiply this map by negatives. So this whole area, essentially over the last 10 years, has been colder than average. And that's the pattern that you see here. When again we look at this trend in SST over a now period up to 2009, just so we don't forget, if we look at the SST trend since 1910, the picture is quite different. So we will come back to a period when this is the opposite at some point in time, and perhaps that's when we need to start worrying about things here in California. The story is familiar. This is the El Nino La Nina pattern. I have suggested that for these longer term periods, we call them El Viejo and La Vieja, after the old man and the old woman. And they're associated with pretty dramatic changes in ecosystems. Here we plotted against time from about 1900 to the present. The abundance of fish seems to vary in concert with these changes in temperature over fairly large scales, as well as in terms of the amount of CO2 we emit. These large-scale changes that I'm going to drill in a little bit, and then I'm close to finishing, are reflected locally in Monterey Bay. I've been pioneering these time series in Monterey Bay. It was nice to hear Tony support them. They're really a labor of love and sweat and tears sometimes. But the conditions of California or of Monterey seem to reflect these large-scale patterns, with cooler conditions or warmer conditions before 1998 and cooler ones afterwards, an increased and more productive ocean, but one that seems to have lower oxygen, which has other consequences. The appearance of jumbo squid has been associated with this change, and I'll show you a nice video of that. And we are also able to measure the same increase that Tony described for the open ocean off of Hawaii, but our decline is actually our decline in pH is actually a little faster than that that's being observed in the open ocean, partly because of this cooling process, and I won't get into the details of that, but somebody can come up and ask me about it later or during the question and answer. When we look at, this is an analysis done by Larry Breker. I'm about to argue that maybe this change that we've seen recently over the last decade is a little larger than one of the ones that we had observed earlier. This is the sea level record going back to 1860 from San Francisco. And it looks a lot like that SST anomaly time series I showed you at the beginning. There is an increase in sea level and then a decrease until about 1910, where it starts to increase, and then it changes rate. And then what looks like happens recently is that the rate starts to decline, which is something that we really hadn't seen before. There had been, or we hadn't seen since, say, 1910, when the rates, it was just a change in the slope that we were seeing as regimes changed. But this one seems to actually have gone to a place where we're decreasing sea level.